information economy has arrived. The world is teeming with innovation as new business models reinvent every industry. InsideAnalysis is your source of information and insight about how to make the most of this exciting new era. Learn more at InsideAnalysis.com.
InsideAnalysis.com.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks. Hello and welcome back once again to the only coast-to-coast radio show in the U.S. of A. that's all about the information economy. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, is here with a couple of fantastic guests, folks. And we're going to talk about what is the object, the goal, the raison d'etre, if you will, of many different software companies and industries and disciplines. Analytics, analyzing things. Why do we analyze things? Well, we do that because we want to make better decisions, right? So these days, with all these technologies we have, it's really exciting because you can learn from your Snowflake instance which products are the most profitable. You can learn from Databricks the same kinds of things, or Teradata or Alteryx, or all these different technologies that we use to aggregate and analyze data. Well, what you really want to do is operationalize those insights. And it's funny because that's a word I used 20 plus years ago, a long time ago, and we appear to have lost Sarang. He's been coming back. A long time ago, we lost Sarang for just a second there, but I used to use the word operationalize literally 22 years ago to talk about business intelligence and to plug in the insights to your operations. That's the whole point, is you want to make better decisions. So how do you do that? Well, by and large, it's a sort of offline process, meaning you do your analysis, you try to understand what's happening, then the human decides, okay, yes or no, I want to do something. Well, that's hard to track. I mean, you can track it in the system where the decision was taken, for example. That's one way you can do it. But there are some pretty interesting ways to augment traditional operational systems and enterprise systems. Business rules management systems are some of those types of technologies. My former boss in Austin, Texas, Damon Consulting, Balagadate, he built one of these a long time ago. And they're very interesting. They are complex, but the whole purpose of such a system is really to give management a more usable and intuitive layer or platform through which to absorb information and then take decisions. So we have an expert in that space today. Denzil Wasson is from a company called Sapiens, and my good buddy Sarang Bapat is with us as well from Mitsubishi Electric. So we're going to try to dive in and figure out what this stuff is, how it works, why you need it. And of course, I love the how you works side of the equation because they're doing some cool stuff there. So with that, Denzil, I'll throw it over to you. First, give us the opening statement about what Sapiens is and what you folks have built over there.
Hi, thanks, Eric. So, hi, everybody. So Sapiens is a large international company, probably about 5,000 employees, and we specialize in the insurance and financial spaces with both entire solutions as well as capabilities that are designed for specific purposes. So things like building specific journeys for customers. The one that I'm here to talk about today, though, is called Decision Management, and it is our decision management system. And I'm excited to kind of share some details with how customers use it, how they benefit from it, and where we're going with it in the crazy evolving AI world that we're in.
That's right. Well, if you think about, so let's say, since you're focused on the insurance industry, there are operational systems that these executives typically use. I'm not too familiar with too many of them because I haven't spent a lot of time in that business, but I'm sure you have some operational system you're using to look at your workflow, to understand what decisions have to be made, analyze some data, and then pull the trigger on something. What you folks have done that's interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is you have built a model that allows the business to map out their traditional workflow, where they get information from, what information they get, what is the logic, the business logic that actually drives these decisions, that drives the businesses, and you let them design a UI essentially that is intuitive, that they can understand and interact with, so they can make some decisions about workflows and processes and things like that, such that IT doesn't have to, because that's usually where the breakdown occurs, is some communication from the business to IT. Hey, we want to do things this way. They say, oh, well, we can't because we have XYZ systems and it's going to be very difficult. So you've sort of abstracted away that challenge to the process And then once the business decides on the workflow and the UI and what the business logic is going to be, that's when you actually go and connect to the operational systems that run things. And that's when IT has to get involved. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's a couple of components that Sapiens offers to give that whole solution. I mostly want to talk around the decision component today, but there certainly are components that they have on the intelligence space where they do the analytics and provide the dashboarding, and then there are components where they allow you to rapidly build front end journeys. And then there's two components that kind of sit in the middle and kind of control this world. And one of them is the decision management. So the decision management, if you think about it, is really the traffic cop within the architecture, as well as not just in terms of controlling what goes on, which is the traffic cop nature, but also the business logic in terms of saying, what calculations are we going to apply? When are we going to apply them? What questions are we going to ask? What are we going to do based on those questions? So if we think about a process, the challenge oftentimes, and you alluded to this, with business over here and IT over there, fundamentally what we try to do with our decision management capability is shorten the life cycle between a requirement that is to do with business logic and operationalizing that requirement. And the problem today is that takes a long time, and also there's sometimes questionable accuracy between what the requirement states and what the operational effect actually is. And so the idea with our decision management capability is that we have a notation that the business can understand. They can play with that actual model and simulate what is going to happen operationally. And then when they say, yes, I'm ready to go, it produces not an entire stack of technology. It produces the segments of the system, generally via web services, that will apply that business logic and provides a standardized API for the systems to hook to. And what we find in industries is a lot of industries are moving towards the idea of having canonical models within their systems. I've quite a big background in the services, the API world.
Okay.
And I have an opinion that the new legacy is integration. Because the services and the APIs themselves, they can move nice and independently, but somebody has to integrate all this stuff. And so there's actually a move afoot that's been increasing in popularity, and that is the adoption of canonical models within an enterprise. And so that actually, whereas previously decision management, you'd be able to say, I'm producing a new service, and that might actually require a development cycle. So we all know that sometimes you can produce a service and not break anything. It just works. Other times you produce a service and it breaks stuff because of a contract change of some description. Right. And so what we find is there's actually a benefit around this adoption of canonical models. Is what we find is these big companies have this model of a transaction. And when you're modeling business logic, you use that same model. And that way, when you produce new business logic, the changes to the calling system are mitigated. And so you're actually reaching a point where you can really go. And we find the majority of our changes, it's only changes that require novel data. Okay, so data that the operational system doesn't even provide. Okay, so as an example, you might have in the last couple of years, somebody might have said, oh, we need to estimate they've had a COVID shot. And operational system doesn't have that. So that would require change on both sides. But oftentimes what we find is people are saying, oh, we also need to look at the other drivers and see if they have incidents. We can't just look at this driver because maybe the whole family doesn't drive well, as an example. And so that's examples of where you can make significant changes to your underlying logic without actually impacting transactional systems.
Yeah, right.
And that's the acceleration. So what we try to do is we try to get the business logic to have a completely separate life cycle and a separate cadence than the operational system wherever possible. And so you have this because, if we think about the transactional system, it tends to move more slowly in terms of saying, we're going to be doing this new business and now we're going to be doing it next year. But some of the rules that you apply to that system, for example, where you say, this is now a hurricane zone and we're not writing insurance anymore, those need to be a lot faster than and that's why we try to separate the business logic from the operational systems to give it a separate life cycle.
Yeah.
And a separate cadence, essentially recognizing it as a first-class asset in the architecture.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting because you're right. The business logic should have its own grammar, as you described it in our pre-call, because the business logic is just saying what to do in which context, right? And the context will change, but you don't want to be tying bits and pieces of business logic to specific machines or processes or workflows, because that's when you wind up with the spaghetti code and all the mess.
Yeah.
And
right.
that's what technical debt comes from, basically, is
right.
from
right.
all of these point-to-point connections that break when something upstream changes, for example, or something significant happens. You know, you reminded me, I don't know if you're familiar with this company, but I think you're doing a very similar thing to a company called Mendix. If you've ever heard of Mendix.
Yes.
So these guys invented essentially a visual programming language that they could use to sit down with the business and IT people and say, look, this is what's actually happening. These are the widgets that are moving around. It sounds like you've done something like that. Is that about right?
Yeah, we do something like that, but we're not doing a low code full stack development environment. We are essentially in the place of providing the services to do the business logic and to do it rapidly and effectively. And I think that, you know, it's really key to understand, you know, for me, the distinction between when we say business logic and people will be immediately think of BRMSs and business rule management systems. And I think the difference between a business rule management system and a decision management system really amounts to a handful of items. And I think for me, one of the first things that is important is the stakeholder accessibility. So we like the decisions to be understood, be runnable in a simulation mode by the business. So they can, instead of trying to do this translation to some technologist, so they can actually look at the model, understand the model, appreciate the model, and execute the model. So I think that the stakeholder accessibility is a key part of it. The second part of it is to have a strong governance and versioning capability with it, because you really need to know that, you know, the business logic is the one that's making the decisions. Are we going to grant this loan? Are we going to deny this loan? And based on what? Okay, so that comes to the next characteristic of a decision management versus a BRMS. Is in decision management, you're looking for full explainability. Why did I make that decision? So not only is the versioning giving us I have an immutable point in time. So if you think of a piece of business logic, you really have to have every version that you've ever deployed, because you've got to be able to recreate deterministically the situation you had before. Right. You know, if I ran last year's transactions, I need to get the same results. And so those things of stakeholder accessibility, very high levels of governance that are appropriate for the enterprise, including version, explainability, and then, of course, the rapid deployment, being able to say, I can get this thing from somebody making a change through to deployment without having to go through a whole development cycle. Those are the things that, for me, get you out of business rule management and get you into decision management.
Yeah, and you mentioned the magic word there, the $50 million word, let's call it, which is explainability.
Yes.
Right, because some of these black boxes that have been used historically for organizations are no go. I mean, that's a non-starter because they're black boxes, and so if you can't explain to a customer, an auditor, or a lawyer, God forsake, what you did or how you got to that decision, like, you lose. Like, that's a violation, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's interesting, is that whole explainability angle really is, you know, it used to be that, well, it was really nice to have some metrics going out and saying, How many transactions did we decide in which direction? Now, how many of our transactions managed to achieve straight-through processing versus manual intervention? And those metrics that come out of a decision management system would feed a dashboard. But now we're in a different planet where, so then we were essentially by the dashboard providing a feedback loop to management to be able to go and change the models. Whereas now what we think about is if we introduce AI into the picture, there's a couple of really interesting thoughts there. Because now, instead of giving management some dashboard of metrics, you potentially are feeding new data into a large language model, where you're saying, here's how my decisions are being made. And so it could potentially analyze and come up with new models for you to execute. And what's interesting is the way that there's really three places where we see the generative AI and decision management really coming together. And the one is the obvious one of saying, I've got all the metrics of what I've done. How did I make decisions? Why did I make decisions? Let me give that to you. So I'm not just going to give you the data. You'll get the data from the operational system that says, this many of these loans went bad and this many of the loans were profitable, so that you can do some loss modeling for the future. But I'm also giving you how I made those decisions as an additional data set to be able to learn. Wow. And then that information can come back to the model in two ways. So number one, what we're doing is we are allowing you to connect declarative logic to AI models directly. So during the execution of declarative logic, for example, you might say, which model do I want to execute? So maybe I'm in a particular geography, maybe I'm in a particular policy or business line. Which model do I want to execute? So I'm doing some logic, and which model do I want to execute? And then, of course, the models right now, the models tend to be kind of a mix of declarative and predictive logic. And we think that should have a clean separation between predictive and declarative, because declarative is oftentimes constraining input to a model. Declarative is also sometimes constraining output from a model. So for example, if I'm writing loans, is the declarative model is going to say, well, based on these losses, this neighborhood, we're not going to apply. We're not going to do any loans yet. Well, that's called redlining. So we need some declarative logic that says you're not allowed to do that. And so there's a real symbiosis between declarative and predictive. Wow. And we think that it's a mistake to potentially say, well, because I could define both of those in R or Python.
Let's pick that up after the break. Stand by. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
The information economy has arrived. The world is teeming with innovation as new business models reinvent every industry. InsideAnalysis is your source of information and insight about how to make the most of this exciting new era. Learn more at InsideAnalysis.com.
InsideAnalysis.com.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks. Back here on Inside Analysis, your host Eric Kavanaugh with Sarang Bapat, my good friend from Mitsubishi Electric, and Denzil Wasson of Sapiens, who was blowing my mind in that last segment there as we're talking about business logic. But it makes a tremendous amount of sense. I mean, if you look at all of the data warehousing that we do, all the analysis, that's abstracting away the data management part. So you've got data, and then you do all sorts of machinations on top of it in your sort of data layer. But data is just a representation of reality, of either products or people or objects or whatever. That's what data represents. And so out of context, it's basically meaningless. But even data within context doesn't mean a whole lot if you don't have the context of the business process and the workflows and the factors that go into decisioning, which in the insurance industry are very, very important. Do I give this policy or not? Should we continue to offer this policy in this particular region or that particular region based upon demographic changes, meteorological changes, all sorts of things can happen. So if you have that business logic abstracted away, it allows you to do different things, to move to different environments, for example. And Sarang, in the break there, you're asking, is this usually used when someone is moving from like an on-prem to a cloud or doing some kind of migration to a different system? And Denzil was, yes, that is a very common use case. But let's just get into this whole business logic abstraction part. I think that's really important because it should not be tied to this machine or that machine. It should be the logic that runs the business, which we can then apply to different environments. What do you think, Sarang?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think business logic is something that business owns and should code for and do testing with. So when Denzel said it felt like what you have built is give them ability to write the pseudo code and almost do the unit testing of all of that business logic and then hand it over to IT versus getting these requirements and then you start to code back and then the unit testing and all that. So you're reversing that from really like business doing the bulk of the heavy lifting on the logic part of it, which is pretty, that I can see why the time to market would be much quicker if we do that. And I mean, in lots of environments where you have a lot of code written everywhere and the logics and those are hidden somewhere in these documents, it's very hard to know at scale or extract that business logic. So if you have a platform that allows you to do that, I think all kinds of migrations would go much quicker. And that's the piece that takes the most time. So it's a pretty powerful tool.
Yeah, well, you make a really good point here that the business should be able to vet the business logic absent any involvement from IT, for example, because you just want to make sure that the logic you've come up with is going to work in the real world. And
Right.
then once that's all laid out, that's when you throw it over the wall, if you will, to the IT side of the house, because otherwise what happens is you run into any number of problems. It could be a business logic problem, but because it's now being tested and it's in that sort of pre-production phase, it's just another problem. And so that all has to be pulled back. You have to go back to the business drawing board, if you will, fix that, then throw it back over the wall again. And that's just a whole lot of wasted time and effort. And the point is you will learn things in the process of testing that business logic, which you're going to want to know, because it's always in that, in the big sort of boil the ocean requirements gathering project, port it over to, okay, let's go ahead and build this huge thing. That never works. It never works the way it's supposed to. You'll get there eventually, but you have to do somersaults and jump through hoops and do all kinds of machinations just to get it to run. And that's called technical debt, right? Anytime you're doing little workarounds, and guess what, everyone in the business world, if something isn't working properly, your business people are going to do workarounds. They just are, because they have to get the job done, right? I mean, I know one of my relatives worked for the VA for many, many years, and she would explain how what a nightmare was using their system for intake, that she would enter dummy data into one of the fields just to get to the next field, just to get to the next screen, so she could actually ask some meaningful questions of the person who she was talking to. Then she would go back and fix it. But the point is to not keep them waiting. She would just put in dummy data and get past. Well, once in a while she'd forget or someone would forget. And so now you've got this dummy data in there, all of which happened because the business logic wasn't sorted out on the front end. So it's like, I'm a big fan of cliches. And one of my favorite cliches says, well begun is half done. And the point is, if you get off on the right foot, then you're going to have a good time finishing this job. But if you get up on the wrong foot, that's when all kinds of problems come into play. So one of the nicest things I like about what Denzil was sharing and the whole Sapiens approach is to abstract away the business logic, let the business people really vet, kick this thing, kick the tires, play around with it. And only once it's ready and you're really satisfied will you hand it over to IT, because guess what? You probably did forget something, but at least you didn't forget 10 things. What do you think, Sarang?
Yeah.
And also, I think if business is doing that part, it kind of becomes a co-ownership. So once the thing is done, there's a good chance of they owning that going forward because they have been intimately involved in that process from the beginning. So that ownership part, which always misses at the, after a while, when things goes into production, now it comes to ownership of that logic or requirements or other things. It becomes tricky to see who did that. this is kind of the first thing to say business actually created this logic themselves first. So automatically kind of stewardship or ownership gets pretty much aligned and probably happily taken by the business in this instance.
Right. Well, co-ownership and having skin in the game, as they say it, right? So if you're because if you're not a co-owner, then it's very easy for you to point fingers and say, oh, you didn't do it right. But it's like, not if you're running this thing and that's what you want. We want the business to get what they need. I mean, this is the age-old challenge of business IT divide, right? And then you look at how DevOps came along and really optimized to a large extent what the business operations people were able to do. But maybe sometimes it goes too fast and you don't have enough understanding around how you implement this. Yes, it works now. I get that. That's better than not working. But if you don't have ready access to the business logic, which is running the system, then you don't really know how it's doing what it's doing. And therefore, that's going to inhibit audit trails. And also it makes things more brittle, right? And when things break in the enterprise, woo, that's when people get fired, right?
Yeah, I
I
mean,
think
it's
No,
powerful.
go ahead, Denzil.
yeah. So there's an interesting psychology around change though, because I think in general the general consensus these days is that you need to be more agile, you need to be more incremental, you need to avoid kind of big bang type implementations.
Right.
The problem with business logic, to your point, is it's very hard to get it 100% right every single time on every single iteration. And so there's two ways to fix that. One is to get the stakeholders much closer to the actual implementation themselves so they can understand it and work with it. And then this one, and I think this is more important because this allows an organization itself to become more agile, is after a business owner has kind of incurred the cost of change several times and has made those couple of mistakes and again incurred the cost of change, at some point do they say, well, I'm not going to change unless the house is about to burn down because it's just so painful.
Right.
And so you get two things. One is the change takes too long, and do I then avoid change and avoid business opportunities because that change takes too long? And so you get into this kind of catch-22, and if you're in a real decision management type environment, it fundamentally gets you out of there because the stakeholder understands it. He can run it, he can execute it, he can test it, he can play with it, and get it perfect in a small iteration that doesn't involve IT at all. And then he reaches a point that says, I'm good with this, then involve IT. So essentially, he can go through 50 iterations for every single IT iteration, whereas previously he had to incur 50 iterations of the whole org. And so it has a profound impact once the organization adopts it and gets it in terms of their responsiveness to change.
Right. Now, do you use samples of data for these? So when you're building out the business logic layer, do you use samples of like test data basically to be able to, so you hit through certain kinds of systems, a CRM system, et cetera?
It's a very part of the difference between a BRMS and a decision management system, again, is the sophistication, particularly around being able to test, to do regression testing, to do A/B type testing, and to be able to import test data so that you can take real operational data and say, I think this logic's going to do this for me now. Let me try it and see. So you run yesterday's transactions through and hopefully get the result that you were hoping tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so that's an important distinguishing factor between again, a decision management system versus just a BRMS. Is can I do that, and how easy is it to be able to do that?
Yeah. Well, and also I'll throw this over to Sarang. When you abstract out this business logic layer, which I have to say I think is a really brilliant idea and makes just mountains of sense. When you abstract that out, it lets the business people really refine their understanding of what it is. Because a lot of times you don't know entirely. You can know 80% of it, but that last 20% maybe you weren't aware of. And, certainly in industries like insurance, where regulations change, policies change, government laws change, like major changes come from the outside world, and these companies have to adhere to that. So if you have this abstracted layer of business logic, it's going to be much easier for you to amend your policies, to amend your workflows. I'll throw that over to Sarang first, and then maybe Denzil comment on it. So you're really, you're facilitating yourself. You're kind of future-proofing your environment as regards auditing and policy and regulatory change, right, Sarang?
And I think the change management around your rules and, to your point, external regulatory environment, or even the internal platform changes, maybe even the people side of equation, right? People who are new to it, people leave, they don't know what the logic is or other things.
Right.
All of that kind of, if you have a way to quickly extract it, and to Denzil's point, to actually test it, I think there's nothing like it. And this is like a music to their ears, probably, to say, I see that logic and I can actually execute and test and see the results, which is pretty powerful concept and super beneficial.
Yeah, it's kind of like a digital twin, right, Denzil? Isn't it kind of like a digital twin?
Yeah, that's exactly. So it's a digital twin on the logic side as to what logic was applied to reach that state in the data. So it's really the data and the logic that have to come together to do that. But it's really beneficial for any policy-driven industry, and particularly beneficial for an industry where policy is not very stable. So where policy changes frequently, and also if there is some kind of jurisdictional aspect. So for example, insurance is impacted by every state. That's might have some nuance change. May not be wholesale change, so it's a nuance change. And so it's important not only that you can accommodate change, but can accommodate nuance change. Because I'm not wanting to clone and own whole rule sets. I'm wanting to potentially say, oh, this is all the same everywhere, except Texas does just this one little piece differently. And a way to manage that effectively makes it powerful. I do think, though, that what the canonical modeling is doing for data, decision management is doing for business logic. Because, to the point that Sarang made a moment ago, is, if we think about the brain drain, the people retiring, all that good stuff, think about having your business logic captured in a lingua franca. The business logic is in one tool, one representation. Right now, the business logic is where? Half in people's heads, so half in the tribe, half in COBOL, half in Java. Some people have it in assembly.
Right.
So who knows the business logic? The machine knows the business logic at runtime. There's huge benefits, not just immediate operationally, but strategically. We think about also the evolution of IT systems themselves. I mean, we know that people are replatforming all over the place. We know that, even I do more business on my phone now than I ever did before. So all of these new channels that are being used to represent our capabilities and apply the rules, are the rules replicated across all these channels? Or are we going to one authoritative repository of rules and using them from any channel? And that's the difference. That's when you get into a decision management space where decisions are a discrete part of your architecture.
Yeah, well, write policy once and then absorb that across all these systems, right?
Absolutely.
That's the magic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You're right. Well, because, I've seen this myself. The phone is different from the web browser. And when you go to any number of services, you'll realize that. Yeah. So if you're, the more fine-tuned you are in terms of understanding technologies, the more you'll realize how often that happens. And it happens a lot.
Yeah. And that's when you say this company needs to adopt decision management.
That's exactly right.
Different rules in different places.
That's right. That's right. Which is a big deal, because you go into this environment and you think you can do what you need to do and you can't. And so like, wait a minute, I can't do what I'm supposed to do. I have to do it by noon. Oh no, like I better go get my laptop to be able to finish this job. I mean, these are not small things, especially when we have BYOD, bring your own device. Apple started out with the iPad and the iPhone. And so all these things are changing. And guess what? You better have some core marshaling area for your business logic so you'll be able to absorb. And we'll pick this up after the break. So you'll be able to use all the new technologies that are out there without having to re-platform everything. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, a fascinating show here. My brain is humming with ideas and thoughts and questions. We've got Sarang Bapat from Mitsubishi Electric and Denzil Wasson from Sapiens talking about their decision management software, which abstracts away the business logic so the business people can focus on optimizing the logic that they want to run the business, which are the rules, the policies, et cetera. And then once they get that right, that's when you plug it in either as a web service to leverage Kubernetes and web services, or perhaps a traditional on-prem sort of environment, and you actually plug into the operational systems that people use. And this does lots of different things. Number one, it's loosely coupled, right? We talked about that in the SOA days years ago. You want loosely coupled as opposed to tightly coupled, because the more tightly you couple something, well, yes, performance can increase, but only for the dedicated use cases you had in mind when you did the tight coupling. When something changes, tight coupling is actually technical debt, and it causes you some trouble, and you have to figure a way around that. But I'm thinking now, Denzil, I'll throw it over to you, and then Sarang will get your thoughts on this. As the cloud matures, and as you have a Databricks doing interesting things, which they are, Snowflake doing interesting things, Amazon, of course, is doing all sorts of different things, Microsoft Azure, to be able to fully and quickly leverage innovations at the hardware level, you need to have that business logic abstracted, because then it's not too much of a problem. But when it's all tightly connected to particular channels, that's when it's difficult to change something. And kind of to your point earlier, Denzil, there's a huge opportunity cost to that, because after a while, executives will just get burned, and they're tired of trying to change something because of all the headaches that it caused and how difficult it was. And so they decide, okay, well, I'm just not going to change anymore. And that's not good either, right? So I think the real cool thing is you're enabling yourself. It reminds me a little bit of why I get excited about Pure Storage, which again is a very different company, but they take a very consultative approach to their offering. So even though they're selling hardware like flash drives and stuff of that nature, they're really selling you an opportunity to go to the next level. Like that's how they view the world is, look, we'll use this hardware as a stepping stone to get you into a next phase where you could do more things. But you guys are even going, I think, deeper than that on this business logic angle, because once you've abstracted the business logic, now you can apply it to whatever technology comes down the pike, right, Denzil?
Yeah, and I think that's a key element, a key enabler of this is obviously the API ecosystem. The fact that you can connect via an API, via well-known protocols, and you can have different versions of an API. So we can have systems that are adopting new versions of logic and other systems that are using old versions of logic for whatever reason. Maybe it's a new business that's rolled out. So I think the API world is a real enabler of this. I think the cost of change is key. If there are some changes in systems that are somewhat pervasive. So for example, if you said, I need a change that involves new data. Then we know that the persistence is impacted, which means that the middleware is impacted, which means that the front end is impacted. Mm-hmm. There are other changes that are like, well, I just want to change some logic. I want to change the conditions under which I grant or deny a loan. And those changes are relatively cheaper, but still involve IT. And if we can kind of say, let's bring that out, make that a separate cadence, and make that change, and literally, for our mature customers, we are talking hours of change where they will say, I'll make my business logic change, I put it to a lower environment, I ratify that lower environment, and then I'm good to go and take it to a higher environment. And so they literally are in hours of changing business logic versus days. And so the IT role really becomes more about collecting data, invoking business logic, reacting to the conclusions of that business logic, and then storing state at some point. That's the IT role. So it's about it's collection, integration, reacting to those conclusions, and storing state. And the actual logic itself, because the logic itself is the hardest part to get right. To get from the stakeholder's mouth into code, that's the hardest part to get right. The fact that I've got a database structure and I need to have a life cycle around this customer of, he's a prospect, and then he's a customer, and then he's a great customer, and then he's a platinum. That's a much easier situation to deal with than the actual intricacies of business logic, particularly if you're in an environment with volatile policy and if you're in an environment with lots of context-based differences, think about jurisdictional differences or states in the union, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so the APIs definitely enable it. You've got to have maturity around managing the APIs and versioning and all those good things. But the key really is, what is the cost of change for my business logic? Because if the cost of change for my business logic can be even cheaper than the cost of change for traditional IT changes, then you're in a good place where you can really react quickly.
Yeah. And, Sarang, I'll throw this over to you because I'm always thinking to myself, okay, how do we sell this internally? How do we get the stakeholders on board? What language do you use to get them over the hurdle of fear of the unknown, basically, which is always the hurdle you're going to run into, is like, oh, goodness, what's this going to do? It's going to make my day worse. And I think from the stakeholder perspective, you will be able to get much finer grain control over how the business operates. And that's what any involved manager or director wants. Like, you want to be able to change things, right? I mean, yes, you want to improve efficiency and you want people to be happy and have good customer service and all that kind of stuff. But really, if you're a director or a C-level executive somewhere, what you want is the ability to change how business gets done. That's what you want. And it's not just an infrastructure change, right? A lot of people will conflate that with, oh, I need to be able to buy XYZ software or big servers or whatever. That's not really the conversation we're having here. What we're saying is, we want you, business leader, to be able to change how the business runs, absent any conversation with, IT or procurement or any of that other stuff. Because you all know that that's where things fall apart, because you have to line up so many ducks in a row to get everyone to agree. And then, okay, now we buy some new technology. And what this does is it really enables the business to control what they're doing. And that allows you the agility to change. And then, to my point a moment ago, leverage the new technologies that come down the pike, leverage Gen AI when it rolls out, that kind of thing. But what do you think about that, Sarang?
Yeah, I think if I'm making a decision to purchase or get that technology or not, software, one thing definitely is, when Denzil, you mentioned, it's kind of somewhat technology agnostic. That kind of helps me a lot, because if I have a set platform and the product comes in that says, well, you have all this business logic, but it works only with Azure, or it works only in this particular platform, it doesn't work with that technology, then I have to change all of that platform, which is a monumental task for me to even think about. A second thing, I think what I think this would do also is, along with the decisions, if your KPIs are not getting met, like for example, you have origination KPIs of 100 loans you originate every day, and you come to find out it's not 100, it's 50. It's giving you, along with that, why other 50 decision was made to not originate is because of the bad data quality or other things. So now it is start to get into your impact in your business to say, here is why. And your decision logic was very easily able to tell you what failed or what kind of exceptions you got for the decisions that were not made correctly, which is a big business leap. Because otherwise, I have been doing this kind of ad hoc, one-off, setting up some workflows, not exactly knowing the quality of the whole business process versus a siloed asset I am doing quality on. So I think that's a big driver for me to make that decision.
Yeah, and when you get the grammar right, to use Denzil's language, then instead of getting some obscure log file that you can't understand or don't know what it means, instead you get a reason the data quality was wrong, right?
Exactly.
And that's, now you're speaking the language of the business, so they can understand and they can go to their stakeholder. Hey, look, it's the data quality. I know because I just saw in the system, right, Denzil?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So first off, there's no free lunch. I mean, this all sounds fantastic, but there clearly is an adoption and a learning curve for the business to be able to adopt this, because you're asking them to say, well, stop writing Word documents or emails, and instead we're going to work and we're going to actually build out these models. So there is obviously, because of the power that you're giving them, but putting their hands essentially on the business logic levers, there's some responsibility. They need to go through some adoption and through some education. But we do help them out with that a lot through the consultative nature of it, also the business friendly nature of it. And then recently, I mentioned that we had 3 cases previously of AI usage, generative AI usage. The first was the metrics.
Yeah, let's pick this up. Let's do this in the podcast bonus segment, folks.
Okay.
So we'll be right back. Podcast bonus segment is coming up. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, time for the podcast bonus segment here on a fascinating show, talking to Denzil Wasson from Sapiens and Sarang Bapat from Mitsubishi Electric about decision systems, decision intelligence, if you will. And Denzil, you were getting into some use cases around Gen AI right when the bell rang. So go ahead and run with that.
Sorry. Yeah. So the three use cases that we're seeing with Gen AI is obviously the outcome of the decision management, what decisions you made, how you made them is a significant input into your AI modeling process. Be it loss modeling or any kind of modeling to be able to produce models. Predictive models that you then want to apply. That leads us to the second use case where decision management essentially allows you to surround that model with declarative logic to be able to say, under these circumstances, I need to select the model to apply. Maybe I need to validate the data going into the model and constrain the output of the model. But then there's the third use case, and we're quite excited about this one because that part of that adoption process of, well, how do I get into this? How do I do this? And so business is really good and can say, here's the policy document, and then give you this volume of, it's all in here. And so instead of IT scratching their heads, what we're doing now is essentially providing large Gen AI capability to be able to take those textual-based policy definitions to put them in the tool and for it to convert it into those logic models that we've been talking about.
Wow.
And so it's not perfect because it's generative. So we all understand that there could be some hallucination and it's based on training and all that good stuff. But the point of the matter is the business stakeholder can take policy that they clearly understood because they wrote it, put it in the tool, and it will generate the logic model based on that policy that they can then immediately go into a validation cycle of. So that cycle of take it from the document, figure out how to model it, do that. We've collapsed that too now. So we want to get to the point that, when you get the email from your state regulator that says, here's a change to policy, you can start to immediately plug it in and run through that process. And so that's kind of
crazy.
The 3 use cases that we're seeing, and we're quite excited about that.
That is a fantastic use case. And I'll tell you along those same lines, the other fantastic, absolutely rock solid use case I've seen for Gen AI comes out of Alteryx. They just came up with magic documents. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but it's just freaking brilliant. What you do is you take your report, like some report from an ERP system or whatever system that you want, system of record, and it generates the normal report that it generates. Then you plug that into magic documents and you tell it which format you want, Microsoft Word, Microsoft PowerPoint, for example, and you hit go, and it just it spins out a whole, how many pages you want, 10, 12, 20 page PowerPoint presentation with all the material from the report. So it's using the report as its factual basis, and the Gen AI capabilities just around weaving a story around that and just spinning up some graphs and charts and stuff like that. And I was like, wow. And you can also change the voice. So you can say, this is the report for the board. This is the report for our consulting partners, and this is the report for our marketing department from the same report, but different voices. And I'm just like, do you realize the amount of time that you just saved for people? And it's relatively painful time too, right? It's like not the funnest stuff in the world to do. So if instead of writing something from scratch, you're just editing an 80% of the way done draft, that's good news.
That's very interesting because we do have use cases where essentially I talked about lingua franca of the decision management of the decisions they're in, and I talked about how they can take policy and create models. And so what happens pretty quickly is the stakeholders are like, well, if anybody asks me a question, be it an auditor or state regulator, or I have to produce some kind of filing, because oftentimes the businesses, financial, have to produce filings for their regulators. And they say, but it's all there. Let me press a button and produce the filing. And so then you close the loop of now you've taken what was policy and was a very static, how do I distribute this, to something that really is able to service multiple stakeholders from the same data source, and can have a very short feedback loop using AI to come back and be changed and updated.
That's crazy. That's so cool. And Sarang, I'll throw it over to you for final thoughts. I think about what you have to do to get your job done, right? And there's just this big stack of things that always have to get done. And what's cool about this business logic meets Gen AI is that if you get the business logic right, then it is kind of like this digital twin for the business logic. And you can play around with stuff and try things without ruining the business, without, reputational harm occurring because you did something silly, right? You can do it in your little test environment and then spin it out. Well, the combination of these things to me is going to save a lot of time, a lot of effort. And back to my number one theme, morale. It's going to improve morale in your organization, because bad morale occurs when you don't know what to do, or you know what to do and can't do it, or you're too tired to do it, or whatever. There are lots of things that sort of chip away at morale. But when you can get stuff done and then get onto the fun things that you enjoy doing, like talking to prospects or talking to clients or whatever, then your morale goes up and the whole business benefits. Sarang, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I think explainability of the product, what Denzil explained, was pretty powerful. Also, like, to his point of when things are changing from policy perspective across states or across countries and all that, and people don't have to figure out which one is which and all that, you kind of have a place to go to and apply that policy at one place. That's extremely efficient, and then to your point, it's enjoyable than getting frustrated with that whole process and to increase the morale. One thing, I wasn't sure if the Gen AI models, does the decisioning system also figures out if some decision goes wrong in terms of model hallucinated or something like that, or that's more on the side of the person who creates the logic for the AI?
Yeah, it's more on the side of the person that creates the logic, that they would provide the constraints. Now, there's nothing to say because you've surrounded these models within declarative logic. There's nothing to say that I can apply a prediction, get a conclusion, and then I could apply another prediction that tells me what are the chances of that conclusion being an hallucination.
Right.
So I've essentially got this world that I can do whatever, and so it's. So yeah, but at the end of the day, the idea behind the declarative logic is essentially to say we need to apply some governance over top of the predictive, because it could be a little bit unpredictable, which is ironic since it's predictive.
I love it. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating show. Look these folks up online. Denzil Wasson from Sapiens, that's Sapiens, and Sarang Bapat from Mitsubishi Electric. Send me an email if you want to be in the show, info@InsideAnalysis.com. We'll talk to you next time. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.